Good afternoon. This is so great to see so many people in the room. You must be here to hear our speaker. So I'm just going to quickly introduce her. It's my pleasure to introduce Sabine Sonnentag, who's a full professor of work and psychology at the University of Mannheim at Germany. She has a PhD in psychology from Technical University in Braunschweig, and her professional journey has taken her to Germany and to the Netherlands. She is a prolific researcher whose basic question that she asks is, how can individuals achieve sustainable high performance and be healthy at the same time? This is a question I think that probably haunts all of us. It's taken her to look at issues like recovery from job stress, proactive work behavior, and learning and self-regulation in jobs. And she's particularly interested in how people combine detachment and non-detachment in their daily lives as a way to create health. I had the pleasure of having her be with us as her part of her sabbatical at the time of Michigan, and I can tell you that she's a wonderful role model in so many ways. I asked her, what does she like to do since she studies leisure time? What does she like to do outside of work? And she does like to do hiking and cycling, but she also just likes to do nothing. So she's a normal, regular kind of person, which is great. And she's going to talk to us today about recovery from daily job stress and subjective well-being, how to make the best of leisure time. So please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much, Jane, for the introduction. And I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to be here and to speak to you. And I would like to thank all of you for coming here this afternoon and for trading in your recovery time for this talk. My background is work in organizational psychology, so I came to the topic of recovery, leisure time, really from the work perspective. And when we look at the work perspective and at work and well-being, the predominant view in the literature is that work can be stressful and that job stress leads to health problems, to poor well-being, and that, of course, is true, unfortunately. And so there comes the need to change work situations, to increase job resources, which is very, very important, and I do not want to deny it. But when we look at this perspective on work can be stressful, we can have an additional view on it, namely to ask what can individuals themselves do in their daily lives, not just being the victims of the work situation, but how can they change something in the areas where they can change things. And that brought me and still always brings me to the question, what is the role of recovery processes of recuperation, regeneration? So the goal of this presentation, what I would like to do is to introduce you to research on recovery that we have been doing in my group. I will demonstrate that recovery is important, and I'm sure you know this. And I will also illustrate that still many questions are unanswered. So I do not have the perfect answer, but there are really many ways still to go. And of course, this research I could not have done on my own, but there were, over the years, very many people involved, and here are just maybe the most influential peoples also who influenced my thinking and my work, and we collaborated. The outline of my talk will be as follows. First, I will speak about what is recovery and why it is important. Then I will briefly speak about vacations, so prototypical recovery time. What do we know about vacations? And then I move to the core concept I will talk about, namely psychological detachment from work during non-work time. I will illustrate the well-being benefits of psychological detachment, But I will also speak about potential benefits of not detaching, and in the end, I will briefly summarize some factors that help versus hinder detachment. So first of all, let's see what is recovery. Recovery can be defined as a process when the functional systems of humans return to their pre-stressor level. And pre-stressor level is an abstract term, and often in our everyday lives, we do not return to pre-stressor levels or to a baseline level, but it means more or less to reduce the strain level. So recovery can be seen as a process opposite to the strain process that is imposed by job stresses or, of course, also other stresses. The underlying mechanisms why recovery can occur is that stresses are removed during recovery time, and there's also the notion that new resources are gained. And resources is a very broad term. In the sense here, mostly it's meant effective resources, self-regulatory resources. What do we gain from recovery? What are the benefits? Of course, you all, I hope, know it from your personal experience, but when we look at research about it, we see that when people feel recovered and refreshed, they feel better and are more vigorous, so they have more energy. They are more proactive at work and show more helping behavior at work, and also they show higher job performance. So it's really an important prerequisite for working and for living well. So let's start when looking at the recovery processes at vacations. So vacations are a prototypical recovery occasion, and we all, or most of us, I think, are looking forward to going to vacation. These are really very special days or weeks during the year. But the question is, does well-being really improve during vacations? And what's maybe even more important, how long lasts this vacation effect? So the first study I would like to present, I did together with Jana Kühnel, and we surveyed teachers who had a 2-week vacation, and we had measures of exhaustion, so the burnout dimension, and of work engagement as introduced by Schauffele and Bakker, what means vigor, dedication, and absorption at work. And we had, for measurement points, we had the assessment immediately before the vacation, immediately after the vacation, 2 weeks, and 4 weeks after the vacation. And these are the findings. The blue line is for work engagement, and you see a slight increase after the vacation in work engagement, and it drops to baseline. And the change is even more impressive for exhaustion. So there's a substantial drop in exhaustion from before to after vacation, which is very nice, and what we all expect from our vacations. But 2 weeks, and particularly 4 weeks after the vacation, the exhaustion level is back at the point where it started. So this means that the effects of vacations are relatively short-lived. That's not only our study, there are other studies that showed a very similar picture. This means vacation effects fade out quickly, and particularly when facing job stresses upon return. So those who had a high level of job stresses when they came back to work, they lost their work engagement and became more exhausted even quicker. So the important consequence of this is, of course, do not go on vacations, but going on vacations is not enough for recovering or for making up for what happens during the whole year. So it's important to recover on a daily basis and not waiting for the wonderful week of a vacation. So, and that's also where our research is about, so really looking at recovery at the day level. So what happens really daily when people are at home after work or engage in leisure activities. So, and the main question here, of course, is what helps to recover? And here one can take two approaches. One approach is looking at activities. So the question, what are people doing? And that's also how we started this kind of research. And for instance, our findings and also that of other groups show that, for instance, sport and exercise activities are very helpful for recovery. Also, social activities help under certain circumstances. But when we did this research on the activities, we thought, is it really the question, what are people doing? Or is it more important to look at the underlying mechanisms that might be more important for recovery to occur? So what is it in psychological terms that helps people to recover? And so we focused during the past years really on something what we call recovery experiences. So what are people experiencing when they are off the job and how this helps to recover? And we looked at this within day and also longitudinally. And in the presentation today, I will focus on psychological detachment from work during non-work time, of course, as a recovery experience. So the question is, how do people mentally detach from work? That's the question which is most important for recovery to occur. That brings me to the task of describing what is psychological detachment. It was coined by Etzion and colleagues as an individual sense of being away from the work situation, and it means to refrain from job activities during off-job hours, and it's not only not working, but it's also to refrain from job-related thoughts during this after-work hours. So that's what people often describe as switching off, getting a mental break, so not thinking about work, but immersing oneself into another world, so to say. A brief words about assessment. So we developed a self-report measure, very brief, 4 items. We have versions in various languages, and we have a general measure that can be adopted to day-specific assessments for daily research and has, of course, good internal consistency. And what's also important, that we can differentiate it from other recovery concepts, for instance, from relaxation. And that holds also for the various language versions. So detachment from work is something different than relaxation. Of course, it's positively correlated, but that's not the same. Now let's look at empirical findings on detachment and well-being. What do we know? First of all, there are quite some cross-sectional studies that show that people who detach from work during their non-work time have a lower level of emotional exhaustion, they have a lower need for recovery, and they have a higher life satisfaction. That's nice, but of course, you all know cross-sectional data don't tell so much. So it's important to go into more detail and to look at the between-person level longitudinally. So does detachment predict well-being over time? And also later I will show within-person studies. So let's look at a longitudinal study that looked at detachment and emotional exhaustion. And we had a time lag of 1 year. And our sample were people working with disabled persons, so psychologists, social workers, and these kinds of jobs, predominantly women. The kind of data we assessed, survey data, we assessed job demands, so time pressure, for instance, that are known to predict emotional exhaustion over time, emotional dissonance, so the feeling of how one has to act openly in terms of emotions do not match to the inner feelings, which is a important stressor in this kind of work. Then we had the time 1 data of psychological detachment and a whole range of control variables, and our outcome measure was emotional exhaustion 1 year later. The findings, we'll briefly walk through it. Control variables, mainly non-significant. Emotional exhaustion at time 1, a very strong predictor of emotional exhaustion at time 2. So that's the high stability of emotional exhaustion. People who were exhausted in the first year were also tended to be exhausted in the second year. So, and that means this is controlled for. Then job demands predict an increase in emotional exhaustion. That's not new. There are other studies that have shown it, but here it's important to note this because this tells us that our sample probably is a very regular, normal sample, nothing very special going on there. Emotional dissonance and job control do not add anything beyond already the initial level of emotional exhaustion. And now the most important question, of course, is what does psychological detachment? Can this predict emotional exhaustion 1 year later? And it can. So the higher the level of psychological detachment during non-work time, the lower the level of emotional exhaustion 1 year later. So people who succeeded in detaching tended to reduce their level of emotional exhaustion, and those who did not detach tended to increase their level of emotional exhaustion. So to summarize this study, we have this increase in emotional exhaustion. We have used a broad range of control variables. We also tested for reverse causation and did not find the reverse causation with this 1 year time lag. And interestingly and nicely, there's another study by Verena Hahn and her colleagues, and they looked at psychological detachment from work during the weekend, so a much shorter time span, and they found a reduction in negative affect and fatigue from pre-weekend to post-weekend in those people who detached very well. So a nice replication or illustration that works also in other time lags. So weekends, when people detached well, they were less fatigued, had lower levels of negative affect after the weekend. So that's something we also should keep in mind when planning our weekends. Now, let's move one step further, look at within-person studies. So here the question is not how do people differ in terms of detachment and well-being, but what are the fluctuations in detachment and well-being within person? So do people differ in their well-being or their affective states on days when they detach well as opposed to days when they do not detach so well? And in a first study, together with Ute Vera-Bayer, I looked at this within-person variations, and people who on days when people detached, they had better mood in the evening, which is nice, but evening mood is maybe not what we are striving for, or at least work and organizational psychologists are striving for. They always want to link it back to work, so the question is, what about the next morning? Does detachment help for affect in the next morning? A study I did with Carmen Benevies and Eva Meutzer, we had public administration employees from Germany and Switzerland, and rather regular sample. And these people had to complete a diary over 5 days, which we had implemented on that time on Palm Pilots. At bedtime, we assessed psychological detachment from work during this evening with an item like, tonight I forgot about work. In addition, we assessed other recovery experiences, relaxation. We assessed mastery, And also we had as a control variable stressors at home, because these stressors might also influence, of course, affect in the morning. In the next morning, we assessed our outcome variables, affect, and we had for affect measures positive and negative activation, serenity, and fatigue. And we also had sleep quality with one item and sleep duration as a control variable. In addition, our participants completed a general survey for demographic variables, but also for the baseline variables of, for instance, the affect measures. Now, when predicting morning affect, here as an overview, we found that control variables such as gender, age, country, leadership position were mostly non-significant. Trait affect, of course, was strongly related to the respective day-specific affect. Day-specific stressors were mainly non-significant. Sleep duration was positively related with the positive affect items and mostly negatively with the negative affect items. Sleep quality strongly related to the positive in a positive way and negative to a negative affect. And then the question is, what about detachment, relaxation, and mastery? And I would like to illustrate it here. Here we have the 2 dimensions of affect, so activation and valence. And we have as a predictor variable detachment, relaxation, mastery, and sleep quality. And we predicted negative activation by psychological detachment. It's a red arrow. This means it's a negative relationship. The higher the psychological detachment, the lower the negative activation in the next morning, and the same for sleep quality. Fatigue, the same pattern, also sleep quality. It's a little bit trivial asking about how well did you sleep and are you fatigued? It's not surprising. But in addition, again, psychological detachment from yesterday evening was significant. For positive activation, it was not detachment, but it was mastery, so challenging, positively activating experience in the evening predicted positive activation in the morning. Again, the sleep quality and serenity was predicted by relaxation, so the low activation, positive valence activity predicted serenity, and again, also sleep quality. So this means this is a very specific pattern of findings, psychological detachment predicting low levels of the negative affective states, mastery predicting positive activation, and relaxation predicting serenity. Interestingly, we tested also for an interaction effect, so interaction effect between detachment and sleep quality, and one might expect maybe a compensation process, but we found a more both factors enhanced each other. This means positive affective states benefit from psychological detachment when sleep quality is good, but not when sleep quality is bad. What I did until now is presenting main effects of detachment, so direct relationships with respect to detachment and well-being. But one could also argue that maybe in addition, detachment might help to buffer the negative effects of job stressors. So detachment might be a moderator in the stressor-strain relationship. And there's some evidence for it. First of all, cross-sectional evidence by a Spanish group. Then in a recent paper, we looked at relationship conflicts, so emotionally loading conflicts at work with coworkers, and we found a buffer effect of well-being decreased when relationship conflicts were high and when detachment was low, so that's the red line. But when detachment was high, people did not suffer from high relationship conflicts. So continuously thinking about these conflicts still when you're at home, that is what is detrimental, but the conflicts themselves might be detrimental, but in this case, well-being did not decrease. And also in the longitudinal study, which I presented a couple of minutes ago, we also tested for some moderator effects and did found them. And also there are some moderator effects with respect to time pressure in within-person studies. So this means that detachment is not beneficial only in itself, but is particularly beneficial when job stressors are high. So detachment predicts well-being and affective states longitudinally and within days. Psychological detachment moderates the well-being between job stresses and impaired well-being. And so it seems that psychological detachment is a protective factor when job stressors are high. Now, that looks nice, and the recommendation could be go detaching. But the question, of course, is work really just negative? Is work something from what we need to detach from? What if work, for instance, is something positive, if it provides positive experiences? Or what if lack of detachment does not refer to a negative content? So if it's not worrying or rumination, is it possible also to not detach and, for instance, having positive thoughts about work? And if we look at research on capitalization or savoring, this line of research suggests that thinking in a positive way about issues might be beneficial. So, and then the question is, could it also be that not detaching can have positive effects? I will present two studies which suggest that this is indeed the case. One study is about positive work reflection, so it's not directly about detaching, but positively thinking about one's work, but what cannot go together with detaching. That's a paper I did together with Adam Grant, and we surveyed or had diary data with firefighters and rescue workers, and they completed diaries twice a day, a total of 228 days. And we assessed in our study immediately after work perceived pro-social impact. So this a sample item is, I feel that my work today made a positive difference in other people's life. And that's very obvious with firefighters, rescue workers, what this might mean. Then at bedtime, we assessed positive work reflection and positive affect at bedtime. Positive work reflection is something like, today after work, I thought about the good sides of my work. And then we looked if on days when our participants experienced pro-social impact, if they also showed higher levels of positive work reflection and more positive affect at bedtime. And first of all, we found a positive association between perceived pro-social impact and positive affect at bedtime. So on days when people felt that they really helped others, they had a higher level of PA before they went to bed. And also they had more positive work reflection during the after work hours, which in turn predicted the positive affect. We had also a measure of positive affect at the end of work in our data set that also predicted, of course, positive affect at bedtime, and that was controlled for. So the positive work reflection is really the add-on on the positive affect at the end of work. Interestingly, we did not find that perceived prosocial impact predicted immediate positive affect after work, which could be due to the stressful nature of these jobs, that the more negative aspects are more salient immediately after work. But when people start positively reflecting, when they have some time off, when they get some opportunity to think about, then they develop these positive thoughts and positive affect at bedtime. So here we see that the positive experience at work, so the perceived prosocial impact, predicts non-detachment. Not detaching, in here now as a positive work reflection, predicts positive affect. I would like to present a second study that also looks at potential benefits of not detaching, and it's a study on affect spillover. And affect spillover is a phenomenon that's well documented in the literature, that affect in one life domain spills over to another life domain. So being in a happy mood at work tends to result in a more happy mood at home, and vice versa. And in a study I did together with Carmen Beneviz, we sampled persons working in the healthcare sector, and that was also a daily survey study with 3 measurement points per day. So this means at end of work, we asked about PA and NA during work. At bedtime, we assessed psychological detachment on this evening and state PA and NA. And in the next morning, we assessed also state PA and state NA. And the question now is there, of course, this affect spillover, which we expected, and could it be that psychological detachment buffers or moderates this affect spillover? So this means when psychological detachment is high, people might experience less of an affect spillover than when detachment is low. Let's look at the findings for negative affect. Now here, negative affect at bedtime. We find for low levels of detachment, so the red line, the typical affect spillover process, the higher the NA at work, so the more irritated, angry, anxious at work, the more irritated, anxious, one is missing, people are also at bedtime. But the green line shows that when people, on days when they detach well from work, there's no such affect spillover, and negative affect is not influenced or not related to the earlier negative affect at work. That is a nice thing. So detaching after negative affect helps you to get distance to this negative affect, and you won't feel this negative affect anymore. But what about positive affect? Here we also have the spillover of positive affect in the case of low detachment, so the red line. The higher the PA at work, the higher the PA at bedtime for those days when people do not detach. So when you are happy at work, when you feel active, interested at work, and still think about this work during evening hours, you remain happy, interested, active, and so on. But when you detach, so that's the green line, this positive association between work affect and bedtime affect breaks down. This means you do not benefit anymore from the positive affect you had at work after you have detached from work. So this means although the patterns are similar, they mean 2 very different things with respect to negative affect and positive affect. First of all, we see that affect spills over and that detachment from work during non-work time blocks the spillover of negative affect, which is a good thing. But it blocks also the spillover of positive affect, what is not such a good thing. And so this means in terms of also practical implications that it would be good, for instance, to have a kind of awareness of one's affective state in order to decide, should I detach or shouldn't I detach? So it's not a general rule after work when you go home to detach, but it could be contingent on the level of affect at work. Now, what I have demonstrated that at the day level, when having positive experiences at work, one benefits from not detaching, which I think is really nice. And maybe 3 years ago or so, I wouldn't have been able to make this statement. But what I would like to do is look one step further beyond the day level. So what we assessed here is really how do people feel at bedtime, or maybe in one of the studies also in the next morning. But what does it mean seen over the week? So what happens if not detaching accumulates over the week? And that's actually an earlier study which fits nicely in the line of reasoning here. And there we looked at detachment and non-detachment over the week in employees with high versus low work engagement. So the idea would be people with high work engagement should not need to detach because their work is so wonderful, they are immersed, they are active, they are energetic at work. Why should they detach? But maybe less engaged people should detach because they don't like their work so much. And what we did in this study, look at positive affect on Friday as an outcome variable. I will go into more detail about the design. So it was an internet survey over 4 weeks. So we surveyed these employees over a 4-week period. We assessed control variables on Monday and the main variables on Friday. And this was work engagement as a between-person variable. We assessed positive affect on Friday afternoon. We assessed detachment during the week evenings, so retrospectively on Friday afternoon. And also we took affect on Monday into account because the weeks might differ, so there might be better or not so good weeks, or about what happened on the previous weekend might influence affect and detachment. So we controlled for Monday affect, and because it was Friday afternoon, we, for instance, also controlled for if people are expecting a nice or not so nice weekend. And what I would like to show you is a comparison of 4 groups. People high in work engagement who experienced low levels of detachment during the week, people high in work engagement who experienced high level of detachment during the week, and the 2 low engagement groups. These are the findings. So we predict a positive affect on Friday afternoon. And excuse me, let's start with the lighter blue bars. These are the people low in engagement. It doesn't matter if they detach or not, they have a medium level of positive affect. Where we find the big difference is in the highly engaged workers, and in the way that those who detached well during the week showed a higher level of positive affect on Friday afternoon than those who did not detach well during the week, although both groups were highly engaged at work. So what this shows is that although people are or when people are highly engaged at work, seen over the whole week, they might need detachment. So being non-detached might be good for a single evening on the specific evening, but if this is something that accumulates over the week, it might be less positive and might be reflected in lower PA scores on Friday afternoon. So that's the immediate benefit when work is a positive experience, but over time that's detrimental. So my conclusion and recommendation is that detachment is important, although non-detaching might be nice after very good days at work and they're reflecting about the nice day at work. What I would like to do within the remaining minutes now is speak about predictors of detachment. So when we can assume that detachment is beneficial for affective states, for well-being, then the question is, what predicts well-being? And that's an area where we know a little, where we have first findings, but where really still a lot of work is to do. I will discuss work variables, person variables, and activities. Let's start with the work variables, and I will focus on time pressure at work. So time pressure means having more to do than one thinks one can do in the time that is available. And what I would like to show you is findings from accumulated over the several studies we have done in my group, linking time pressure to detachment. And it's there's a breakdown by time pressure starting at the left-hand side with no and low time pressure to very high time pressure. And on the y-axis, you can see the percentage of employees in the sample who report low detachment or very low detachment on our typical detachment scale. And what you see is as time pressure increases, the percentage of employees who do not detach or nearly never detach increases dramatically. So we have a strong negative correlation between time pressure and detachment. And there are several reasons for it. One could be a very simple one, that tasks are not finished and one thinks about unfinished tasks when being at home. It could be that one anticipates time pressure for the next day, thinks about, ruminates at home. It might be also a more underlying, partly physiological process of activation, so that time pressure is something that is activating, and when being in an activated state, it's difficult to not continue thinking about work. So, and what really needs to be done in future empirical studies is to tease out the mediating processes. And what's also an issue is that in this slide, it's cross-sectional evidence with all its well-known problems. And there's a recent study by Ulla Kinnunen and Tara Feld, so colleagues in Finland, who collected longitudinal data, and they report that time pressure and related demands predict poor detachment, but there's no evidence for the reverse causation. Excuse me. So it's the time pressure that predicts poor detachment, and not poor detachment that predicts time pressure would be also possible. In addition, we know from quite some studies that workload and high time pressure predict need for recovery. So people are more fatigued, are subjectively feel that they want to recover when they have time pressure. And this brings us to a very difficult situation. So when having high time pressure, one needs recovery, but at the same time, it's very difficult to detach. And that makes it even worse for these people with high time pressure. It seems that it is particularly time pressure, but there's also evidence that also other job stressors, such as social conflicts at work, for instance, also make psychological detachment from work during non-work time particularly difficult. Now let's move to the person factors. There's some also empirical research on negative associations with detachment. So looking at person variables that make detachment difficult. First of all, that's job involvement. Job involvement is a person factor, or persons are job involved who say that work is a very important part of their life. So really putting very great emphasis on work, and putting this great emphasis on work means that it's difficult to detach. But although job involvement, work engagement are related, it's not work engagement that is negatively related to detachment. So being engaged, being dedicated, being absorbed, being energetic at work is fine in terms of detachment if one succeeds in detaching. So it's really the value, the emphasis on which is job involvement, and not the experience of being engaged, which is detrimental for detachment. And poor detachment relates also to negative affectivity, but it's not the same. But people high in negative affectivity, which makes sense, so they tend to ruminate, to think about the not so nice things at work, they do not detach. Now, what should facilitate detachment? There's really very few, if at all, any research. It should be involvement in other life domains. So that's the opposite to job involvement. So not being highly involved in the job, but in other life domains. Could be the family, could be volunteer work, could be a hobby, should help to detach. And it might also be that something like being mindful, so being really trying to be in the present moment, should make it more difficult not to detach, because not detaching means not to be here, not to be in the present, but to be at work, and that is not compatible with being mindful. Let's look at activities. So the question is, what are people doing, or are there specific features of activities that might help detachment? And first of all, in one study, we found that exercise, sport activities predict detachment. Interestingly, this was irrespective from the kind of activities or the kind of exercise activities. One could expect that there are some exercise activities like running or swimming where it's very easy to continue thinking about work. This was not the case, so it was across all exercise activities. And in another study, we found that volunteer work was something that helped people to detach from their paid job. So having another type of activity which is often also very demanding, that puts another meaning in one's life, helps to detach from the paid job. And of course, also here we could look at the quality of the activities, and in a study by Hahn and colleagues, they reported that absorption in the activity is what is related to good detachment. And that might be also what underlies the effects of exercise and of volunteer work. So it's the absorption, the immersion in the other activities. So no, let's say, mental space is available for thinking about work. Now this brings me to the last point, how to achieve detachment. So what could we do? Where should we look at? One recommendation, of course, is reducing job stresses. This means reducing time pressure, for instance, by setting clear goals and priorities. That might not reduce all time pressure, but might help to alleviate it a little bit. And second, to manage social conflicts at work so that they are not taken home. In addition, it's important to aim at task closure while at work. So unfinished tasks, having no closure, will give people the tendency to continue thinking about it. So it's important to finish tasks when being at work, not to start a new task just 5 minutes before you plan to go home, because then you start thinking about how to do it. And on a very practical side, of course, flexible work hours might help, because that help you to extend the time a little bit to get the work finished and not to leave at a specific point in time. And then what probably is very important is to work job-related intrusions into non-work life. Very important, very, very difficult. And this means to set boundaries and to limit job-related emails, job-related phone calls during non-work time, or to manage well to set these boundaries after having checked emails, after having answered the phone calls, and to engage in absorbing non-work activities. So whatever this might be, and my really most favorite example, I cannot do it myself, but I think it describes it so nicely, is having bodily activities and playing with balls, doing some sports that really catches your attention and where it's impossible to think about work. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Sabine, for that really powerful presentation, both in terms of the science and in terms of the applicability, I'm sure, in our lives. In case you're wondering, I might add a few things on what people can do to help with detachment, Sabine, and that is to join the International Positive Psychology Association so that you can get things like newsletters, so you can join the Leaders Series calls and so forth. We'll talk about more about that tomorrow, but I think that would be a nice positive way to detach at the end of the day. Also, I assure you we did not set out to plan an analysis of the value of conferences in your life. But is it just me, or, Marty had that slide on last night about conference being a protector in tweets, and then we heard from Barb Fredrickson about micro moments for positivity resonance, and then what could be a better way of detaching from the workaday world than coming to a positive psychology conference? So anyway, So hope you enjoy your evening, and we look forward to seeing you back here tomorrow morning. Thank you.